is well below 2.5. So you can see that the steady decline now, what is it an outcome of? Clearly, more and more people are getting tested. We know that the infection is far more common and therefore far less deadly than it was predicted to be or be felt. Or even today, I would imagine this information needs to get out. People out in the streets do need to know that while from the medical side, we're still learning what can be the long-term implication of this on an individual's health and life. We do know in terms of death numbers and in terms of the extent of infection that it is far more widespread. We have very large proportion of Delhi, Mumbai. We know this from other countries, Berlin, New York, LA. Very large percentage of people within these cities have shown to have antibodies, which means they are they have been infected and have the antibodies to fight this. And against this wider infection, the death numbers, therefore, the infection fatality rate itself, therefore, is looking better and better because it's really a very small fraction. Now, the other thing to note is while there is a great race, I think, in the common media to map the total number of cases, and every other week you hear about India surpassing some country or the other and how the numbers are not going down. And actually that is true, barring a few cities like Delhi and Chennai, the infection very much remains, and even Bombay now is about stable. But the infection is growing. Now, of course, as of last night, we have just a little under 16 lakh cases. But the important thing to note is almost 10.5 lakh out of this, so close to 65%, are people who have recovered from this. So they have tested negative, so they have recovered. Now, around 33.5, so 1/3 of this overall number, around 5.3 lakh are current active cases. And the death numbers are around 35,000, so which means 2.2%. So you have to realize that while we are mapping the overall cases, and that number can be frightful to people in general, but it's important to know that recovery is very high and the death numbers are coming down every day. The other thing to bear in mind is that many countries like Japan, like Iran, like Korea, and many of the Western European countries showed a very quick sort of containment become effective. So they were able to reduce the active numbers once they imposed large restrictive national lockdowns. And they have seen numbers come down subsequently for many weeks. But it is also true that in many of these countries, particularly Iran, now Japan, you are seeing major resurgence. In fact, Iran has a second wave, which is almost as much, they have as many active numbers now as they did in March or early April. The numbers in Japan, after having fallen to under 3 digits, now again, the active numbers are close to 8,000. So countries are going to see resurgence. That is the nature of this virus. Till we have a vaccine which is commonly available to all, you are going to see outbreak and this virus emerge in the form of human infection. But again, the thing to note is that we do know how to take care of it. Governments everywhere, and in India for sure, we know that every state, every district now has dedicated COVID facilities, COVID hospitals. Are they enough? We frankly don't know. Because in a real-time basis, it would be nice to know exactly how many beds are there, what is the vacancy available, how many doctors, how many healthcare, corona warriors, as we call them, how many are really out there. That actual number is, can be quite comforting. But you can imagine, while we do not have disaggregated district-level information on these capacity, we do know that every state and every district has now got testing and dedicated COVID facilities. So these are, reasons why we believe that the death rate or the case fatality over time is declining, because we do know that when a case becomes severe, at least the protocols are there and more people do have access to hospitals and are actually recovering. Now, One thing important to keep in mind is that, of course, while the overall number of cases in India are likely to continue rising, and the reason we say this is, the nature of this virus is such that the entire population is susceptible. So while this number can continue growing till we have vaccine available to all, as of now, even though our number overall are quite high, and about the third highest globally in terms of just the absolute numbers, you have to really look at the relative number, relative to the population, because the entire population is susceptible. And today, India has about 1,100, under 1,100 cases per million population. Now compare that to a country like Chile, which has around 18,500 cases per million population. Or look at the US, which has about 13,000 cases per million. You're seeing, or Western Europe, if you see, UK has about 4,500 cases. Other countries with similar temperature, let's say Mexico has around 3,100. India with under 1,100 really seems like a case of having, as of now, the number of cases which are still looking relatively better in terms of just the spread of the infection. If we look at the total deaths per million, again, we have under 35,000 deaths, or just about, and relative to the population, India is reporting around 24 deaths per million people. Now that is very, very, it looks like a good figure, relatively, much lower than almost all Western European countries. Imagine UK has around 690 deaths per million. Countries like Chile have around 400, almost 500. Peru has around 560. Look at Russia, has around 92 deaths. So in India, if you have 24 deaths per million population, it does look quite, it looks as if the severity of the infection in India does look quite muted, and we should acknowledge that. Now, of course, the projections are that the numbers will continue to grow, because the active cases in India are still growing at around 3.2%. And that means, the numbers are continuing to grow. Now, an important thing to bear in mind is we're a very large country. So doing analysis at an all India level is almost like doing an analysis for all of Europe. That just means that we are hiding a lot of the variations across states. So we have to therefore dig deeper at the state level. And we do know here that India has, right from the beginning, mimicked Maharashtra. Maharashtra is a very nodal sort of a point, a hotspot state as far as COVID infection in India is concerned. India has always mirrored what Maharashtra has gone through. So we know that Maharashtra has around a little under 4 lakh cases, and India has around 15 lakh. So you can imagine now the increase in the daily cases in Maharashtra need to be controlled if we are to control this virus overall in the country. A state like Tamil Nadu now has also seen a massive growth. Right from the beginning they've had large growth, but the good thing about Tamil Nadu COVID experience is that the death rate is quite low, and that's something we should be happy about. Delhi as a state has seen a remarkable recovery over the last 1 month, where we are seeing recovery rate of almost close to 90%, and the death rate fall below 3. So you have around 2.5, almost 2.8% death rate. Now, Andhra Pradesh is our increasingly sort of becoming a hotspot as far as the country is concerned. They report the highest number of new cases yesterday, around 10,000. So you can imagine that there is a shifting focus as far as this infection is concerned. Karnataka, after many weeks and initial months of good containment, is now again seeing a resurgence, a very major one around Bangalore. Many states like UP, Rajasthan have done remarkably well as far as keeping this infection under control. Now you can imagine these are also states where the health infrastructure is very limited, so it becomes particularly important to have a containment strategy which is effective. And the states have also kept overall death rates low, but again, you are seeing an increase even in these places. Kerala, after many months of excellent containment, is now seeing a very large number of cases emerge. In fact, now Delhi has, on a daily basis, fewer new cases than Kerala. And this is eventually what successful containment means. Now new cases begin to decline. And we are seeing that in Delhi, every consecutive day, fewer cases, new cases are coming up. And this has been the case for now over a month, and something we're very happy about. We have to, again, of course, also study this data at a district level. We have to go beyond states, because states in India are also very, very large. But again, important to note that in Kerala, after months of very successful containment, now they're reporting close to 1,000 new cases a day. Now, remember that the infection will grow. And therefore, just given the nature of this large federal democracy, where it's impossible to curtail people the way perhaps you can in authoritarian countries like China. And so, you've had the reverse migrant movement. And of course, that is how the infection grows now from the tier 3, tier 4 cities. Now the infection is likely to move further towards the rural area. So infection will grow. It's important, therefore, for the policy objective to be very focused on minimizing the death numbers. So minimize the death rate in every state. If you look at particular cities, then in terms of cities, our biggest hotspots are Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Thane, Pune, Bangalore, Kolkata, and Kamrup metropolitan, which is basically Guwahati city around that area. And we are seeing that, again, while Delhi is looking better every day, Mumbai has very much stabilized and has been reporting on an average 1,000 new cases per day for the last more than 2 months. Which means, thankfully, while it is not exploding, it is unfortunately also not improving. We're not seeing the daily new numbers come down. Chennai has reflected a good recovery, similar to Delhi, but it has become stable around 1,000 new cases a day now for almost 3 weeks. And this number needs to keep continuously coming down for having, to then declare that a city has truly contained the virus. Now, Maharashtra, other than Mumbai, has 2 other major hotspots, which are reporting daily more number of cases than Mumbai, and these are Thane and Pune. Pune is reporting close to, this is of course the district of Pune, is reporting more than 2,000 cases a day. Again, the issue is always with respect to what is the healthcare infrastructure within these cities and what is the kind of care that they can support. So the hotspot in in Maharashtra clearly seems to have now sort of dispersed beyond Mumbai to Thane. Bangalore is also now, for the last almost 1 month, reporting around 2,000 cases a day. So you have had a massive increase in terms of overall number of cases. Kolkata is reporting around 700 on an average case a day. Now, the thing to note is, again, like I mentioned, the infection will rise. What's happening to the deaths? And this is where we have to see that eventually the number of people we lose, or which is an eventual outcome that we should be monitoring closely, it becomes a function of what is the health infrastructure doing. How much extra capacity have we created beyond hospital beds in terms of fever clinics or quarantine facilities, in terms of providing good support to also do successful home quarantine, etc. So it's as much a management of resource problem as it is of creation of newer infrastructure. And here we are seeing that Delhi has more numbers than Mumbai, but clearly Delhi has been much more successful in terms of recovery because Delhi is reporting almost 90% recovery and with under 4,000 deaths overall. While Mumbai is showing around 76% recovery and overall death numbers are more than 6,000. So the death rate in Mumbai is 5.6% of all cases, which is pretty high. given the all India levels, and particularly if you compare it with Delhi. Chennai, therefore, is also a city, a district we should feel proud of, because while Chennai has reported almost 1 lakh cases, they have had close to 2,000 deaths, which means it's about 2% death rate, which is lower than the all India average. So you can imagine that cities, even though the caseload might be increasing in certain cities, the management of resources and the provision of care has been timely in terms of minimizing the death. And eventually, I think that is the objective of public healthcare service and policy at a time like this, in the midst of a pandemic. Now, Thane and Pune are both areas we are watching very closely, particularly because we are keen that it doesn't mimic Mumbai in terms of the death rates. But these are both cities where the cases are increasing as of now, and the number of deaths are rising. So Thane has about over 90,000 cases, and they've already reported around 2,500 deaths. So that's close to 2.8% death rate. So that is high. It's much higher than the all India average. Pune, again, more than 2,000 cases daily. So we are keeping a close eye on what's happening as far as death numbers there are concerned. Now, if you compare Pune and Thane to Chennai, then it tells you, look, Chennai has more cases than Thane and Pune. And yet, again, management and availability of resources has meant that the death rate there is 2.1%, while in Thane it's close to 3%, and Pune it's about 2.4%. So, overall, these are indicators of how we are managing outbreak. Bangalore is a city where the outbreak is seen a major resurgence, and therefore more than 72% cases currently are active. It's a very large number of active cases. Thankfully, the death rate there is still under 2%. So again, a city which we need to closely monitor. Calcutta has also shown rapidly rising recovery, but Calcutta has also had way too many deaths given the case load. So their death rate is almost 3.6%, significantly higher than all India average. So, that's the way you sort of break up the data and try and understand what is happening in terms of we are managing this pandemic at a local level. The one thing to note is what has happened over successive time period is, of course, while the overall numbers have been increasing, the growth rate itself has been declining successively in every consecutive lockdown. So we have seen the growth rate of active numbers, growth in the infection, that speed beginning to slow down. Of course, overall the number is very large, so any positive increase is still a big increase overall. But thankfully, the speed is going down. And this decline in the growth of cases has also, growth rate of cases has also been reported post the lockdown, which means from early June. Now, of course, the decline is, the decline in the speed should happen further. We really have to contain it. We have to see more Delhis and Chennais around. We have to see these numbers decline in other parts of the country as well, which means we have to, take this growth rate down to very, very low, close to zero. That slowdown isn't happening fast enough right now, and I think that's where the sero surveys that are being done across cities are quite, they're quite insightful, because we've clearly learned that the prevalence of this infection is quite wide, which means many people are infected or are carrying antibodies to COVID virus. And again, vis-a-vis the vastness or the commonality of the infection, the death rate begins to look relatively better, much better, which means this isn't, in fact, this is definitely a lot less deadly than, let's say, TB or many other large infectious diseases, which remain big killers in India. So COVID might not be, it is unknown, but it might not be as fatal. And I think that message needs to go out to people and to citizens at large. Now, so what do we know so far as the pandemic is concerned in India, that while we have reduced the growth rate of the virus and the infection, but we have not peaked yet. The lockdown has had a very significant impact in reducing this speed, but this reduction in speed has not been uniform across the country. We're talking about a very large country. And I think it's the failure to have an effective containment strategy of isolation, tracing, and testing, and subsequent, if required, proper hospitalization and care, that states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh now, you are seeing that the infection is continuing to grow. But more importantly, some states, namely Maharashtra, Gujarat, MP, West Bengal, are also reporting fatality rate or mortality rate which is much higher than India average. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that we need a lot more data to really understand and to come up with specific decision policy making as far as managing this pandemic is concerned. Now, the statistics I'm showing you are national level or at best state or district, city level. It's important to know that to really understand what is happening vis-a-vis the infectiousness of the virus, we really need to estimate many fundamental parameters of this disease and infection at a patient level. Right? So we need estimates of what is the incubation period. How long does it take for a person to show symptoms once he or she has been infected? That's the incubation period. Equally important are parameters like serial interval, the reproduction rate, which is one infected individual ends up infecting how many more secondary infections. These are not parameters that can just be calculated from mathematical models. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. Clearly, it has not served us well over the last 4 or 5 months because we do not have estimations of these from the patient level data. You see, the better we understand exactly how the disease is spreading, what is the age category that is particularly susceptible, men versus women. We do know broadly that older people are impacted, people with comorbidities are impacted, but a lot of that knowledge about this virus and its implications is coming from other countries. It's coming from the developed part of the world. We need to do our own data analysis and estimation, right? The fact that comorbidities might not all be equally deadly. Some comorbidities might lead to a more complication. These are all empirical, open questions. We really need that level of data analysis to then say what is the kind of policy response beyond enforcing strict physical distancing through lockdowns, whether at a national or a state. Because clearly for a country at our level of economic development and our level of per capita income, we cannot sustain lockdowns for very long. It has very significant opportunity cost on lives and livelihoods. And therefore, having precise estimate and precise knowledge helps us develop precise policies. For instance, from the previous SARS epidemic, we do know that not everybody is equally infectious. So even in the previous SARS-1 pandemic, we knew that it was closely 6% of cases that ended up infecting more than 80% overall number of cases. So again, estimating, doing cluster analysis, can we identify super spreaders? What are those 6% that might be infecting others? These are empirical sort of estimations that need to be done. And the minute you're able to isolate super spreaders, you can develop policies of containment for super spreaders and thereby having a much more targeted intervention rather than blanket lockdowns. The other is, of course, also in terms of understanding, what is the duration of quarantine that is important. And that's where having actual estimate of what is the incubation period or what is the serial interval becomes very important. That should people be quarantined for 2 weeks, 10 days, 1 week, you develop better protocols when you have the local knowledge. Now, because we do not have a lot of this, data analytics and the capability and the data itself, which is it's a big pity. And personally, for me, that is my biggest sort of disappointment with the way we have handled it, is that if the more information we have from patients, we are in a position to control it far better, right? And because we do not have that level of information is why the environment, the climate of policy making, and not just at national but state and local level, has remained speculative. We are still depending on mathematical models and overall account of cases. Containment strategy is not as customized to the needs of that particular district. We are having containment strategy which are based on overall protocols that we have been following for the last 4 or 5 months. So we need much more precise estimate of exactly how this infection is spreading. Now, overall, we do know that there are 3 scenarios globally that have been talked about. That one could be that we have one other in the winter season, autumn, let's say, we'll have one other more severe wave, and you're seeing this increase in Europe. So perhaps we are at the beginning of that big second wave or the second phase. But after that, it becomes a seasonal flu-type pandemic every year until we have a vaccine. Or it could be like the Spanish flu, that we've had one round which was bad, we'll have another round which will be worse, and after that it really peters down. The third scenario is that perhaps we will have severe flu-like season happen every year, and till we have a vaccine available to all. So these are all open-ended scenario projections. And the idea of businesses and governments is to plan against these different kinds of alternate scenarios which are there in the market. But globally, we are seeing that many countries, of course, smaller countries are more successful. Island nations are much more successful at containing the spread. But come to think of it, China has reported around 80,000 cases total. And just Delhi, I mean, where we are sitting, Delhi itself has more than more than a lakh cases. So you can see that, first of all, the quality of data that is coming from a lot of these authoritarian countries is suspect. I don't think we should take them lying down. You have to take it with a pinch of salt when you begin to analyze and compare recoveries across countries or success of containment strategy. But we are seeing that, Western Europe, if you look at Spain, you look at France, countries where, they've had, or Germany, which has been perhaps the most successful in terms of containing. Now remember, each of these countries are also now comparing themselves with Sweden, and Sweden is in turn comparing itself to Germany and others, because Sweden did not impose a lockdown. Now, I think that is where public health culture and traditions in different countries come to play. It is quite common in Sweden for people to self-isolate when they have infections or some kind of flu. But the numbers in Sweden, the death numbers, since they have not had a lockdown, the death numbers have been significant compared to Germany, where they had a relatively more successful lockdown. France and Spain, they had a lockdown, after which they did bring down the infections considerably. But Spain is seeing a second resurgence, and France has plateaued. In fact, the number of active cases in France remains significant even now. They have not reduced it like Germany has, for instance. So every country is going through its unique containment strategies and witnessing very different sort of experiences. Now, within India, eventually, I think how we will measure the success or the performance of states, the governments, and people, I think, in those states over time, will be eventually based on the death rate, the COVID death rate in these states. And that is where it's important to know that while all India is around 24 deaths per million, Delhi has more than 200 deaths per million. Maharashtra has 111 deaths. Tamil Nadu has 44. Gujarat has 36. But at the same time, you have a state like Sikkim, which has 1.4 deaths per million. You have Meghalaya, which has around, again, the same 1.4. Kerala has 1.74. So it's important to note that even though infections might rise, that's how you have to see places like Kerala or Tamil Nadu, where, and we'll see what happens in Andhra Pradesh or in Karnataka. These are states which have robust public health and overall healthcare infrastructure. But we'll see eventually what is the death rate. And some of these states have managed to minimize death numbers very, very significantly. And it's quite commendable how some of these states have managed to keep the death numbers down. One other thing based on the common conversation around is, of course, we try and proxy how much effort a state is making in containing the spread in terms of looking at the testing numbers, because that's the only number publicly available, and we do know how critical testing is. But remember, test is one part of the package of response, policy response. Contact tracing is very, very important as well, especially if we are to isolate more infectious cases like super spreaders, etc., or try to get ahead. Quality of the testing itself can be improved if we can target far better. Simply because, given the scale of demand for testing, though India is now testing we've seen a rapid increase to around, we are doing close to 12,500 tests per million. So it's around 5.5 lakh tests a day. Now, of course, additional capacity has been announced this week, where we are now aiming to have about 1 billion tests a day. Overall, again, in terms of adequacy, there's nothing called we are doing enough tests or we need too much tests. You just have to continuously keep testing more because the knowledge of the infection really comes from the testing. Now, while India has ramped up testing significantly, today we are testing much more than Japan, Thailand, which are much richer countries. The positivity rate in India has also been rising, and that means that for every 100 tests, the number of people coming out positive, that has been increasing, and that number is now close to about 8.5% overall. And thankfully, in the last 3-4 days, the positivity rate has begun to flat, which means that I'm hoping it will decline as we ramp up testing more. But again, what you say at an all-India level is quite broad. You really have to go down to specific states, because states have performed very differently in their, testing capacity and their willingness and capability of testing. If you look at states like Rajasthan, you look at states like Uttar Pradesh, you look at states like Punjab, you look at Jammu Kashmir, you look at Assam, if you look at Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, these are states which have managed to keep their positivity rate below 5% overall. And 5% is the WHO benchmark. You shouldn't have more than 5% of tests coming out positive, and then we say that that is a good amount of testing out there. The problem is most of our hotspot states like Maharashtra has had positivity rate of above 20% for more than a month. In fact, for last 3 months now, Maharashtra has had positivity rate above 15%. So it's very, very high. Meaning, given the level of infection, the amount of testing is very inadequate. Similarly, we have seen that with the infection, the positivity rate in Tamil Nadu has also been increasing. Finally, it is beginning to flatten. Delhi has finally begun to see for the last 1 month decline in positivity. And this is where now I'm using all tests for assignment interchangeably, and that cannot be. The test for the virus itself, which is the RT-PCR test, is more accurate and required versus the antigen test, which is really meant to pick up over larger population whether how many of them on an average have it. So those tests are not meant to be used interchangeably, and yet right now we are really trying to optimize all the capability that we have within the state to be able to go out and catch as many cases in order to put them through the recovery phase, or if needed, put patients into the hospitals. So huge variations across states. Now, overall, of course, remember that the infection is still out there. It is still, spreading, and we cannot continue to remain in an economic uncertain climate simply because it is quite non-sustainable for a So when we've had a lot of the economic packages being announced by the center, different states are doing their own bit, it's important to realize that the roadmap for economic recovery in India, just like any other country, but definitely for us, that roadmap goes right through the healthcare space. The more information we give to people, the more we are able to contain the spread, the more we do for the healthcare sector itself, the more facility we provide for treatment in terms of whether quarantine or active beds, etc. The more we do in healthcare vis-a-vis this particular infection or broadly infectious diseases for healthcare, we are able to reduce uncertainty, which overall in the economy. Because remember, under uncertainty, people don't consume, invest, or work, frankly, when you have so much uncertainty driving your everyday decision making. So when some people say that perhaps our demand right now is low, and that is a big problem, and therefore we have to work on the demand side of the slowdown or the economic recovery. The problem is, without fighting uncertainty, right now, even if we were to roll out a large universal basic income and give cash into pockets of people, it's unlikely that all of that cash will get translated into demand, active demand, because under this kind of uncertain environment, climate, you do see precautionary savings go up. People are not going to consume the entire amount. So we have to be right now thinking more in terms of everything we can do to lower uncertainty. And one good way to lower uncertainty is for governments to communicate clearly, regularly, in as many detailed and localized information as possible, so that individuals and citizens of the country know that if I am infected, if my loved one is infected, what is the recourse? How many beds are there? Are the doctors there? Is there a treatment protocol? If I'm quarantined at home, will someone come and watch and help me and handle and so on? So I think giving out more information and simultaneously building that infectious disease management capability in the healthcare space, these two things can work very well and strongly in terms of assuaging fear and reducing panic in the market, which will impact overall economic activity within the country. And you heard in the FM's announcements, in fact, the last comprehensive economic package which she did, that India has announced that every lab, every block in our country will have a testing lab. Every district hospital is now going to have an infectious disease ward. And that's because, of course, we're in the midst of a COVID pandemic, but remember, more than 4 lakh people die of TB in India every year. So infectious disease is very much a long-term running problem that we grapple with, right? So it is a good time to create these fixed capacities for us to be able to optimize human capital and reduce uncertainty in the market. But it's very clear that the economy is in a contraction. In fact, when the IMF had come out in March and said we'll still grow at 1.9%, I was definitely puzzled because, making predictions or forecasting economic activity based on previous trends is definitely not going to work in the current setup, because we've had a major structural shock. And so we have to really be forward-looking and try and understand economic activity through the disease management exercise. So healthcare then becomes a very fundamental part of economic recovery for India. So we are seeing a contraction. We're likely to see sort of an extended contraction, and this will impact very large number of, it has already impacted a very large number of informal workers. This will definitely impact the NPAs of our banks. It will aggravate things further. And yet, we do know that our strategy, a long-term strategy to really recover out of this, will have to become containment, contact tracing, testing on a continuous basis till we have vaccines for all. Because we have to fight the fear and the uncertainty as much as the virus itself. And of course, the government of India has used the last few months to also rein in certain structural reforms, certain long-term reforms, whether it is in the agriculture sector or opening the space sector to private investments and private experimentation. You are seeing some states see this window of opportunity as ushering in long-term labor market reforms. We saw the cabinet approve of the education, the new education policy. So we are going to continue to see the government at the center, and I think some of the states use this time to think afresh in terms of what can we continue to do to make India more market friendly, more human capital friendly. And that's why health and education, that's why I speak for both these sectors, why they are very fundamental to long-term sustained growth of any economy. So we have to renew and continue to put focus on these both these sectors. So I think I'll end with that. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that entire session, along with the comprehensive PPT. So, ma'am, there's a question from Kush Demla. He asked that it is fairly natural for the death rate to fall when testing rises. So, is it fair to attribute that to a better healthcare?
No, I think it is not better healthcare. We are learning about the reality of this virus. And that's why more testing, more antibody testing, more prevalence, if it is eventually leading us to the truth, which is how deadly is it truly, that is a better outcome. So we do know from a lot more testing now, not just the current CFR that I showed you, but also a lot of the antibody testing, that coronavirus is far more common and therefore far less deadly compared to what it was perceived commonly earlier. And I frankly think it is still perceived to be very, very fatal and deadly, and the fear and panic around this virus is sometimes quite irrational, and I think in our country particularly.
Yes, ma'am, that's very true. Another participant asked, Sheenpal asked us whether West Bengal has opted for a strategy of lockdown on certain days of the month. Can this be effective?
Well, I'll tell you, any lockdown, if any lockdown will reduce transmission, will reduce the infection. The point of a lockdown always is to do it at a minimal cost. So, that's why we have said that, national lockdowns were effective, but they are not sustainable. We have to worry about all-cause mortality. Remember, people are not dying only because of COVID. Lockdowns are impacting access to healthcare of many other kinds, right? Whether patients have access to normal care, inpatient care, what is happening to cancer treatment, what is happening to the regular dialysis, etc. And that's just in the healthcare space. We do know that lockdown imposes tremendous economic cost on a local economy and the national economy. So lockdowns are going to be effective. Now, what is the best way to lock down? That is still an open-ended empirical question, because UP has started with weekend lockdown, right? West Bengal is now trying to target certain days. I'm not yet clear exactly, how the pattern and, is it targeting times when you are supposed to see more gathering and therefore you'll be able to disperse. But lockdowns are effective, almost always on an average. The question is, what is the cost of the lockdown? At what cost?
Yes, ma'am. And in fact, then you mentioned the strategy for lockdown. There's a question that asks that the crisis of COVID-19 has brought a global surge in surveillance activities. However, a sunset clause to terminate the use of such technologies is absent. So, what do you think about the threats which people are posing now, and what kind of policy can effectively balance the situation?
Well, look, privacy of data is you've already had the Supreme Court of India make quite a progressive announcement on that, and I think the government has to find ways of doing business around this law. So I think privacy is very important, and access, consent, informed consent is very important. That's why we're now sort of seeing the creation of an infrastructure around consent, because eventually data is used for so many market solutions. It's not just the government. That architecture of consent has to become strong and well sort of adopted. But in the midst of a pandemic, we also have to understand that we have laws which basically suspend individual rights. So when you talk about the Epidemic and Disease Act, an infectious disease like this, or an infection, does mean that you're not only posing it's not just you once you have the infection who has a threat, but you are also the externalities around, the negative externality, meaning you're going to infect so many other people around you, that the state can suspend your rights and curtail some of those rights. Meaning you can be contained, you can be kept in your house, forced to stay in quarantine, right? So we are seeing that we have to understand what is good for the society as a whole. And sometimes in these kind of extraordinary circumstances, it is okay to suspend individual rights for the sake of overall society. And I think that is also sort of the overarching view when you think of contact tracing apps. Every country has launched its contact tracing app simply because the infection spreads very fast. So one of the best ways to really keep tab of or do the contact tracing is for people to enter this data on their own, or to have, download this app and then just put some of the details about your infection, because it helps you do more effective contact tracing. Now, again, in India, this is, and elsewhere too, what have been the impact of these kind of, technological solutions to contact tracing? All open-ended questions, but we do know that, the theory for it is there. And better contact tracing can lead to preempting the infection and being able to catch the disease early or the infection early also means you will reduce the death rate overall.
Absolutely, ma'am. Given that these are extraordinary times, like you mentioned, there's another question that asks about the demarcation of the state responsibility versus the local. It asks that considering how the Kerala model has served as an example of how local bodies have the power to cater to people's needs better than the central government during a calamity or emergency, do you think there is a need to grant greater authority to local administration in times of crisis?
Well, but health is a state subject. I mean, yes. Remember that the roles of the central government and the state government are quite different when you're thinking about currently what they should be doing to contain and help the country overcome. They both have their roles. I think the role of the central government is more from, the ICMR, understanding the disease itself. Because remember, there are lots of fixed costs attached to this kind of research. And we have very few institutions, and most of them are under the central government, under the Central Health Ministry, developing protocols and guidelines for not just the testing, but also for the disease protocol, how patients have to be quarantined. So those kind of detailed advisory and guidelines have to come from the central government. Of course, the central government through ICMR, NCDC, ministry, etc., are also helping every state establish testing capabilities. Because these are all new demands. I mean, of course, remember, India, infectious diseases, that's why I keep telling you about TB. We haven't done enough in the last 70 years. And so suddenly we are faced with this massive surge in demand for testing and care of infectious disease against an infrastructure which has been very, very limited. Now, as far as the Kerala model is concerned, we have Kerala model, we have there was one in Rajasthan, a model for some time. We have the Dharavi model. Then people spoke about the Agra model. Look, models will come and models will go. We have also seen enough of the pandemic to know that we can't say that a particular state or a city has overcome for good, right? And Kerala, I think, has managed incredibly well, simply because it has the state capacity, it has the health department capacity at district level, at administration. It has the, if you look at the non-government, sort of the community organizational capabilities. You have community leadership. It really takes all parts of the society to come together, and they did really well for a long period of time. And yet today we are now stuck in a position where Kerala is clocking. The infection is out there. It is clocking many more cases than Delhi or our big hotspot cities. Now that has to remind us that infection will grow. Eventually, what Kerala has very successfully managed to do is minimize the death rate. Very few people are dying in Kerala relatively to COVID than all India, let's say, on an average. And I think that is something which is commendable.
Ma'am, given that you just mentioned about the state infrastructure and whether you have the capacity to, ensure medical facilities for COVID, Anuti Sundaram asked that how are we making estimates about states like UP that have not revealed their data? How do we frame policies considering we don't know the magnitude of the problem in some states, and how do you propose to tackle them?
So one thing is, I'll tell you, we have to be driven by policy issue, the data issue. I think there is a lot of people perceive that UP is very large and intractable with very poor government capacity, and therefore the data is missing. That's not true. By the way, let me tell you, every country, every state within India is grappling with this real-time putting together of data. That we are not doing enough with the data, or that we don't have access to individual level data, is an all-India problem. It is not a UP problem necessarily. Okay? UP is testing a lot. UP has been testing a lot. In fact, it is quite remarkable and contrary to many people's expectations, particularly folks within the public health space, that UP has always been the top 2 or 3 states as far as testing has been concerned. Now, remember, UP is very large. So when you start looking at per capita or per million, again, that number looks very small. But we have never had random testing in India in any case. We have been testing based on contact tracing or symptoms, right? Now, you can say whether this is good or bad, but compared to most states, the positivity rate of tests in UP has been under 5% throughout, which means they have truly stayed ahead of the infection. So we have to give credit where it is due. Now, the future, we'll see what happens, because UP clearly has relatively limited health infrastructure and a much bigger population to cater to. So we'll see what happens, but as of now, I think UP is doing a commendable job.
Wow, I think most of us have the misconception that UP is not doing enough, and this is genuinely surprising even for me. So there's one last question because of paucity of time, and overall, how well do you think the government decisions have reflected the inferences from COVID data?
Oh, there, Ishita, very unequivocally, I think we are not doing well at all. I think, look, the political acumen around locking down, the pragmatic, the truth being that we have very limited health infrastructure, so a preemptive lockdown becomes almost a necessity. That apart, but the fact is that, when I'm seeing in the markets, in the private sector in India, being able to leverage data to come up with such excellent product and service solutions based on data. Why is the government not being able to analyze and put out real-time patient-level information saying, what is the age profile of COVID patients? What is the morbidity? Who is on the mortality? What age group is particularly susceptible? Which comorbidity is particularly debilitating? Right? Can we do cluster analysis and say that we were able to identify super spreaders because we know that entire population is not equally infectious? So I think in terms of data and analytics, I think very clearly we are way behind the curve, and we are still looking at the Western countries to provide us with real-time knowledge on the disease. And I think that is also part of the frustration, and therefore the reliance on mathematical models. It's been 6 months into the pandemic. We cannot be now predicting. We need real-time estimates from data, not models.
Yes, ma'am, that's absolutely true. India does have a long way to go. But so far, well, that really offers us tremendous insight into how economic thought evolves and how policies are designed. It has been an absolute pleasure to have a conversation and learn from someone with your experience, ma'am. We're incredibly grateful to Dr. Shamika Ravi for taking out the time and imparting knowledge to the entire student body. I would also like to thank everyone who joined us for the session. It will continue to remain on our YouTube page. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Take care, all of you.